same day, oh, too long. The ears can't stand to hear the same old song. I don't leave the highway long enough to bunk down in the mud. I've got rambling fever in my blood. Well, I caught this rambling fever long ago, when I first heard that lonesome whistle blow. And if someone said I ever gave a damn, then them sure told you wrong. I've got rambling fever all along. Rambling fever, the kind that can't be measured by degree. Rambling fever, there ain't no kind of cure for my disease. Sometimes I'd like to bed down on a sofa, let some pretty lady rub my back, spend the early morning drinking coffee, talking about when I'd be coming back. I don't let no woman tie me down. I never get too old to get around. I'm gonna die along the highway, run away like some old high-line pole. Rest this rambling fever in my soul. Rambling fever, the kind that can't be measured by degree. Rambling fever, there ain't no kind of cure my disease.
It is history's best-known uprising on the high seas, the subject of books, poems, and major Hollywood films. But even after 2 centuries of documentation, many questions still surround the Bounty, its captain, and the band of men who commandeered the ship. Whose account is the truth? What inspired the insurrection? And perhaps the biggest mystery of all, what happened to Chief Mutineer Fletcher Christian? Join us for the true story of Mutiny on the Bounty.
Pitcairn Island, 1980. Author Glyn Christian arrives on this tiny South Sea island intent on untangling the many mysteries surrounding his great-great-great-great-grandfather, Fletcher Christian, the infamous leader of the mutiny aboard the English naval ship Bounty.
Some people said he was born on the Isle of Man, some people said he was born in Cumberland, some people said he died on Pitcairn, some said he came back to Britain. And I realized that there was absolutely nothing was really known. And that as the mutiny, as I always thought, was really one man against another man, Christian against Bligh, if you didn't know who Christian was, you didn't know what the story was.
The story of Fletcher Christian begins half a world away in the rolling countryside of northern England. Born on September 25th, 1764, young Fletcher enjoys a protected, privileged upbringing of culture and refinement, until fate intervenes.
Fletcher's father died when Fletcher was only 4 years old. Now, his older brothers were taking money from the estate for their smart university educations. And when Fletcher was in the middle of his teens, suddenly they were bankrupt. He had no future at all.
Without a university education, Fletcher soon realizes that his only real career option is the stormy life of an English sailor.
He went to the Royal Navy at the age of 19, a very late age for an officer to go, a person looking to be an officer. And I think myself that the Navy was just something, when he got into it, is not what he wanted.
Despite his misgivings, Fletcher begins looking for an opportunity to sail. He writes to a family friend, Lieutenant William Bligh.
Wages are no object. I only wish to learn my profession, and if you would permit me to mess with the gentlemen, I will readily enter your ship as a foremaster.
Impressed with Christian's earnest appeal, Lieutenant Bligh helps him land a position aboard the merchant ship Britannia, sailing to the West Indies in 1786. For Christian, Bligh proves to be a fortuitous choice as a mentor. Bligh was only 15 when he was first assigned to a naval ship. Since then, he spent every year of his life sailing all over the globe.
Captain Bligh was a man of many capabilities, many facets. He had his good points and bad points. He was a master navigator, a master marine surveyor and chart maker. He had this uncontrollable temper, and he had such an ego that he always felt that, you know, nothing he did was wrong. He was always right, and everybody else was wrong.
Despite his abilities, Bligh's prickly personality constantly undermines his career. While serving as master under Captain James Cook in 1780, Bligh so antagonizes his superiors that he is the only officer on the entire ship denied promotion. With his ego bruised, it's no wonder that Bligh takes young Christian under his wing.
Bligh and Christian were a father-son relationship. See, Bligh had no sons, only daughters. Fletcher Christian's father and his grandfather both died when he was very young. So it was the perfect father-son relationship.
Perfect, perhaps, except for the hidden personality quirks of each man. Though Bligh's temper and ego were obvious, Christian, too, had a dark side, masked by a gentlemanly demeanor and apparent self-control.
He had what psychologists call a borderline personality, which means that he made very intense attachments to a person and tend to expect them to behave in ways that are unrealistic, and therefore when they do not behave that way, you will react with tremendous hurt.
But with 2 successful voyages aboard Britannia behind them, neither man has an inkling of how dangerously mismatched their personalities might be. Christian and Bligh eagerly return to England to await their next adventure. They will not have to tarry long. London, 1787. The city is abuzz with news of a looming financial disaster. The high cost of feeding the slaves on sugar plantations in the West Indies is cutting into investors' profits, even threatening the national economy. English botanist Joseph Banks proposes an expedition to Tahiti to collect dampier trees whose fruit tastes like fresh-baked bread. Transported to the West Indies, these breadfruits could provide unlimited free food for the slaves.
Sir Joseph Banks had been on Cook's first expedition to the South Seas and had liked breadfruit very much. And since he also had holdings in the West Indies, so it was in his own interest to get breadfruit to the West Indies.
Banks oversees the purchase of a coal ship, the Thea, which he rechristens Bounty. To command the ship, Banks requests 33-year-old Lieutenant William Bligh. Bligh quickly accepts the assignment.
His career had stalled. So when this opportunity came along, you can tell from his correspondence, he was really excited about it, because this was him back in business again.
The shrewd Banks clearly recognizes Bligh's unique qualifications for this endeavor. Having sailed to Tahiti with Captain Cook, Bligh knows the South Pacific, and because of his lieutenant's rank, he comes at a bargain price.
He is called a captain because he was the commanding officer of the ship, but actually in Royal Navy rank, he was only a lieutenant. He tried to get the Royal Navy to get him a promotion to captain, and they said, get on with the job, and when you come back, we'll talk about it.
Despite his disappointment, Bligh presses on with the task of hiring a crew for Bounty. For the vital position of master's mate, he chooses his favorite protege and good friend, Fletcher Christian. By October 1787, Bounty is fully crewed and provisioned, but forced to remain in dock awaiting sailing orders from the Admiralty. Infuriated by what he views as yet another personal insult, the lieutenant rages to a friend.
If there is any punishment that ought to be inflicted on a set of men for neglect, I'm sure it ought on the Admiralty for my 3 weeks' detention at this place during a fine wind, which carried all outward bound ships clear of the channel but me, who wanted it most.
And his letters rail and attack the Admiralty in everything. In fact, if his letters had been known to the Admiralty, he might have been charged with disobedience and insubordination.
While the delay enrages Bligh, it provides an unexpected and fateful encounter between Christian and his brother Charles, who has just arrived from India on the merchant ship Middlesex. It will be more than 200 years before Fletcher Christian's descendant Glynn uncovers the amazing details of that fateful meeting. In previously unpublished papers, Glynn finds the shocking revelation that Charles had been involved in a mutiny on his latest voyage.
Therefore, the last thing Fletcher Christian did was to speak to an older brother about whether or not it was right to mutiny against a captain who was mean, unkind, a bully.
The idea of his brother mutinying kind of took mutiny out of the unthinkable and put it in the realm of the possible.
On December 23, 1787, Lieutenant Bligh finally receives his orders, and Bounty slowly sails from Spithead Harbor, bound for Tahiti. As both the gruff captain and his genteel protege watch the English coast recede into the distance, neither Bligh nor Christian can imagine the implications of their botanical mission. When we continue, the tropical pleasures of Tahiti prove an irresistible temptation to Bounty's crew.
For young, healthy men to find cooperative and pliable women, Tahiti was, you might say, a sailor's sexual fantasy come to life.
Fletcher Christian has been portrayed on screen by some of Hollywood's greatest leading men, among them Clark Gable, Errol Flynn, Marlon Brando, and most recently Mel Gibson in the 1984 film The Bounty. History's Mysteries will return on the History Channel.
January 1788. After a month at sea, Bounty's crew falls into a steady routine. As the vessel makes its journey south toward Tahiti, Lieutenant William Bligh notes in his journal,
My little ship does wonderfully well. My men are all well and cheerful.
but Bligh's official log does not contain the whole story.
Bligh wrote what was true so long as it was favorable to him. There was a lot of incidents that took place on the Bounty that never made the log, and you find those in James Morrison's journal.
In February, 27-year-old boatswain's mate James Morrison records a volatile confrontation that never appears in the ship's log. When 2 massive rounds of cheese are found missing from the ship's stores during a routine inventory, Lieutenant Bligh angrily accuses the crew of thievery.
Henry Hillbrant, who was not involved in this particular errand, stepped forward and said, "Don't you remember, Captain, we took the cheeses to your house along with some other little provisions aboard." And Bligh just went into orbit and flew at Henry Hillbrant and shook his fist and said, "If you utter another word, I will give you a damn good flogging."
Days later, Bligh further alienates his crew by replacing their bread rations with rotting pumpkins. When the crew complains, Bligh once more explodes.
You damn scoundrels. I'll make you eat grass or anything you can catch before I've done with you.
I think that's the point at which the crew respect for Bligh started to deteriorate, because they recognized now they did not have a straightforward, honest officer. They had just another run-of-the-mill who was going to line his pockets.
Despite the turmoil, Bligh gratefully notes the emergence of one shining star among his crewmen, master's mate Fletcher Christian. On March 2nd, Bligh rewards Christian's diligence with a promotion to provisional lieutenant, making him second in command aboard Bounty.
There could not have been a better leader on the Bounty. Everyone followed Christian just by the wink of an eye. He did not even need to give a command. He was very popular among the crew.
He and Bligh both felt they had a right to rule. Bligh because he had the uniform, he had the medals, but Fletcher Christian because that's what he was born to.
April 1788. Lieutenant Bligh pushes his crew to exhaustion as they attempt to round Cape Horn at the height of the storm season. For 30 days they fight the relentless seas before finally admitting defeat and setting a new course for the easier passage around the Cape of Good Hope. With a trailing wind, Bounty makes the passage to the southern tip of Africa in record time. But more controversy awaits her there. To buy gifts for his family, Fletcher Christian borrows money from his friend Bligh. This simple act soon proves to have dire consequences as Bligh begins badgering Christian about the loan.
Christian's reaction to this would have been very pained. He was as close to being a gentleman, a Georgian gentleman, as one can imagine. And for it to be suggested that he didn't honor his debts would be deeply personally wounding.
As they set sail once more, a pall hangs over the ship. In his journal, James Morrison records the mounting tensions.
During this passage, Mr. Bligh and his messmates, the master and surgeon, fell out, after which they had several disputes and seldom spoke but on duty, and even then with much apparent reserve.
With crew morale flagging, Lieutenant Bligh is relieved to finally sight the distant hills of Tahiti on October 25, 1788. The men quickly forget past squabbles as they marvel at this strange island paradise. A land of tempting, abundant food, and even more tempting women.
The voyage was 10 months and 3 days to finally get to Tahiti. So, you know, after that long, for young, healthy men to find cooperative and pliable women was, Tahiti was, you might say, a sailor's sexual fantasy come to life.
Fletcher Christian is especially entranced by this strange foreign land. He immerses himself in the native culture, learning the language, mingling with the women, and even submitting to the painful tradition of Tahitian tattooing.
Most people on Bounty actually lived on board the ship. They didn't roam around Tahiti. Fletcher Christian was on the island for all that time, and he had full sexual experience. He'd grown up.
The whole lifestyle, the culture on Tahiti was kind of laid back, enjoy life. And this, of course, was the direct opposite of what the Royal Navy believed in, and Bligh. And the sailors were kind of embracing one while Bligh was trying to hold them back into the real world, the Royal Navy.
Inevitably, the two worlds finally collide. On the night of January 5th, 1789, 3 Bounty sailors quietly steal a boat and desert the ship. An enraged Bligh makes a point of personally hunting the men down and having them flogged. But in his zeal, the self-centered captain fails to recognize that the desertions are just a symptom of the dissension spreading throughout his 43 crewmen. When we continue, a desperate Fletcher Christian attempts the unthinkable.
Christian yelling at Bligh to be quiet or he will run him through. And to Bligh's credit, Bligh essentially challenged him to go ahead and do it.
In 1663, more than a century before the mutiny, Fletcher Christian's great-great-great-uncle, Brown William Christian, was put to death for treason against England. History's Mysteries will continue here on the History Channel.
After more than 5 months on the island paradise, the British ship Bounty weighs anchor from Tahiti on April 4th, 1789. Standing along the decks, the crew members bid tearful farewells to their Tahitian lovers and friends. Softened by their extended time on land, the crew struggles with the return to duty.
As soon as they departed Tahiti, Bligh recognized that things were bad and that he was going to have to tighten the reins and bring this crew back to an efficient state. And so he was in this period where he was particularly annoying and aggravating to the crew and certainly to Fletcher Christian.
But Christian was having none of it. He was an entirely different person. He was an adult, and he simply wasn't the person that Bligh had under his thumb anymore.
On April 23rd, Bounty reaches the Tongan island of Namuka. Christian leads a supply party ashore to gather wood and water, but turns back empty-handed when the natives threaten them.
Bligh went into one of his tantrums and said, how could you let a bunch of savages, naked savages, get the best of you when you had firearms? Well, true, he did carry firearms, but Bligh had given him orders to not use the firearms, and at that point, Bligh flew at Christian and called him a cowardly rascal.
When Bligh called Christian a coward, that would have led to a duel ashore immediately, but dueling was forbidden on ships.
4 days later, Bligh once more insults his senior officer, this time over a bunch of coconuts that he thinks Christian and the men are stealing.
And Christian said, I don't know how many I have, Captain, but surely you don't think me so mean that I would steal your coconuts. And Bligh went right into orbit, flew at him, shook his fist in his face, and said, "Yes, I do, you thieving hound."
To be called a thief, of course, was equally bad as a coward. And the two combined triggered his breakdown.
Later that night, crew members find the demoralized Christian tearing up his personal papers and throwing them overboard.
Christian was definitely suicidal. He had planned to build a raft on which he would get away from the ship. He just wanted to get away from Bligh.
Master's mate George Stewart tries to convince Christian to give up his suicidal plan. He pleads, "When you go, Christian, the men are ripe for anything."
Now, what Stewart must have meant was that since Christian was so popular with the crew, he was needed to keep the discipline on board. But Christian may have seen it the other way. If they are ripe for anything, then I can do something else than suicide.
Just before daybreak, April 28, 1789. After 3 weeks of habitually berating his crew, Captain William Bligh awakens in his cabin to find a wild-eyed Fletcher Christian standing over him, a raised sword in striking position. Bligh screams out, "Murder!" but it does him no good. Christian's mere handful of co-conspirators has already secured the ship.
It's hard to pin down the exact number, but there was about 11 or 12 that decided that they would, take the ship. The mutiny was actually a mutiny of Fletcher Christian against Bligh. It was not a crew mutiny. They kind of went along with this idea of getting rid of Bligh and everybody going back to Tahiti. But the instigator and the motivator for the mutiny itself was Fletcher Christian.
Fletcher forces Bligh onto the deck, clad only in his nightshirt and with his hands tied behind his back. Bligh attempts to rally his supporters, but is cut off angrily by Christian.
Hold your tongue and I'll not hurt you. It is too late to consider now. I have been in hell for weeks past with you.
Christian holding the cord to Bligh's wrist with a bayonet at his chest, yelling at Bligh to be quiet or he will run him through. And to Bligh's credit, Bligh essentially challenged him to go ahead and do it, and Christian did not have the courage to do it. He did not want bloodshed, as a matter of fact.
Bligh's challenge seems to bring Christian back to sanity. Ordering the largest of Bounty's lifeboats lowered, Christian forces Bligh and 18 loyalists into the 10-seat launch. Other crewmen beg to be included, but there is not enough room.
There were more loyalists than there were mutineers. The number is kind of hard to pin down because in the course of things going on deck, some started out as mutineers and actually went in the launch with Bligh, and some were loyalists that ended up going with the mutineers.
Although his supporters far outnumber the mutineers, there is little Captain Bligh can do. He watches helplessly as his precious breadfruits are thrown overboard by the derisive crewmen.
After having undergone a great deal of ridicule and been kept some time to make sport for these unfeeling wretches, we were at length cast adrift in the open ocean.
Though the launch rides dangerously low in the water, William Bligh resolutely steers it to the nearby island of Tofua. Unfortunately, the welcome he receives there is less than friendly.
The natives discovered we had no firearms and made an attack on us with clubs and stones, in the course of which I had the misfortune to lose a very worthy man.
Bligh realizes that the closest safe haven is the Dutch colony of Timor, an island more than 3,600 miles away. Although he has only the barest navigational equipment and just a 5-day supply of food, Bligh confidently insists that they try for the distant refuge.
and he made them agree that they would abide by his rationing of what little food they had, and they solemnly agreed. He led a prayer, and then they embarked on this voyage to the Dutch East Island of Timor.
When we continue, Captain Bligh battles against the implacable sea.
The open boat voyage, as is known, is probably one of the most significant navigation and seamanship events in the history of the sea.
Elsewhere in the world, in 1789, in New York City, George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. In Paris, a mob stormed the Bastille prison, igniting the French Revolution. And in Northern Europe, the Austrian Netherlands declared their independence and formed a new nation called Belgium. To search any time in history, please visit the World Timeline at historychannel.com.
Set adrift by the Bounty mutineers, Captain William Bligh and his loyalists find themselves in the middle of the vast ocean, 3,600 miles away from the nearest settlement. Stormy seas constantly soak the shivering men and threaten to overturn the small boat at any moment. Hunger gnaws at them as they subsist on minute rations of bread and water and the little they can catch.
Monday, May 25th. At noon, some noddies came so near to us that one of them was caught by hand. I directed the bird to be killed for supper and the blood to be given to 3 of the people who were most distressed for want of food. The body, with entrails, beak, and feet, I divided into 18 shares, and with an allowance of bread, we made a good supper compared with our usual fare.
So this was the demonstration of the kind of skill that Bligh exhibited when things were bad. Right? He held his crew together, and historians basically agree that he essentially kept them all alive.
After 41 brutal days and 3,618 miles at sea, William Bligh and his emaciated crew sail into Kupang Harbor, Timor, on June 14, 1789.
The open boat voyage, as is known, is probably one of the most significant navigation and seamanship events in the history of the sea.
While William Bligh and his loyalists have been fighting for their lives, Fletcher Christian and the mutineers have been searching for a safe place to start new ones. After a failed attempt to settle on the island of Tubuai, Christian reluctantly sails Bounty back to Tahiti.
Fletcher didn't want to return to Tahiti because that meant discovery, absolutely. He knew, even if Bligh was dead, the King's Navy would come looking to see what happened. So to live on Tahiti was simply to sentence himself and the other mutineers to death.
By the time they reach Tahiti, the 24 Bounty crewmen have decided to part company. While 16 men choose to remain and risk the chance they may be tried as mutineers, 8 elect to sail on with Christian. Most will never be seen again. On March 17, 1790, Lieutenant William Bligh gratefully returns to the warm embrace of his wife and daughters in London aboard the Dutch ship Leite. With the public clamoring for details of his adventure, Bligh quickly publishes his version of the events.
To lose a ship, even a minor voyage like this, doesn't exactly do your career very good. To lose it by mutiny always puts a black mark over you. So he had to get his account out to get back in favour with the Admiralty.
A Navy court officially exonerates William Bligh for the loss of Bounty on October 22, 1790, and promotes him to the rank of captain.
The only thing that the Society and the Admiralty, for that everybody knew, was Bligh's own story. And so he was aggrandized and became the lion of society for a while.
Fletcher Christian had predicted that the Admiralty would hunt them down as traitors, looking first in Tahiti. And he was right. 10 bounty crewmen are captured there in 1791 and returned to England the following year to face trial for mutiny.
One of the interesting things about the court-martial is the primary witness, Captain Bligh, wasn't there, because Bligh was now on the other side of the world on his second breadfruit voyage to Tahiti to repeat the voyage that he had left undone the first time with the bounty.
Without their captain's intimidating presence, the crewmen speak frankly about their experiences on the bounty. Contrasting portraits of both William Bligh and his nemesis Fletcher Christian begin to emerge.
In the court-martial, the testimony was, I would walk through blood to save this person. Christian, he was the best officer that we ever had. Only positive comments about Christian and never a positive word about Bligh.
Despite the men's compelling testimony, 6 of the bounty mutineers are found guilty. While 3 of the condemned eventually receive pardons from the king, the rest are publicly hanged from the yardarm of the HMS Brunswick on October 29, 1792. William Bligh returns to England in 1793 after a second attempt to transplant breadfruit trees from Tahiti to the West Indies. Expecting a hero's welcome, Bligh is shocked to discover that public opinion has inexplicably turned against him.
When he got back from the successful breadfruit voyage, the first lieutenant was taken to the Admiralty for questioning, but not Bligh. Just was persona non grata as far as the Admiralty, and then, you know, the man in the street was concerned.
Bligh soon learns that the accusations leveled by the court-martialed mutineers have begun to circulate and gain credence through the efforts of one of Fletcher Christian's brothers, Edward. Even though Fletcher has not been heard from in 4 years, Edward deftly argues his brother's defense in a pamphlet called The Appendix. In it, he attests that it was William Bligh's treatment of Fletcher that actually precipitated the mutiny.
The crime itself in this instance may afford an awful lesson to the Navy and to mankind, that there is a pressure beyond which the best formed and principled mind must either break or recoil.
I think that finally the publication of the appendix turned Bligh's public reputation from being a hero to being that bounty bastard.
Though he eventually rises to the rank of admiral, William Bligh is forever dogged by controversy.
He didn't only have a mutiny on the bounty, he was involved in 3 mutinies. The bounty, the general mutiny of the Royal Navy at Spithead in 1797, and also when he was made governor of New South Wales. So he had a controversial career.
Perhaps because of Bligh's continuing infamy, the London press voraciously rehashes every twist and turn of the bounty saga. In 1796, newspapers begin printing excerpts from a book entitled Letters from Mr. Fletcher Christian. Soon, all of London is abuzz with rumors. Could the book actually be genuine? And if so, where is the infamous writer? When we continue, the search for Fletcher Christian resumes.
I researched all the different ways that he was supposed to have died. Most of them are impossible.
Fletcher Christian named his first son Thursday, October Christian, in honor of the day and month of his birth. The young man later realized his father had incorrectly calculated the date and changed his name to Friday. History's Mysteries will be back on the History Channel.
By the late 1700s, speculation surrounding the fate of mutineer Fletcher Christian rises to a crescendo with the publication of the Letters of Fletcher Christian. the book remains a bestseller for the next 10 years, until fact finally displaces the fiction. In 1808, an American seal hunting ship, Topaz, anchors off the tiny South Pacific island called Pitcairn.
They were going to send some people ashore to see if there were any fresh water on the island. When a canoe came out with 3 young men in it, Captain Mayhew Folger of this American vessel Topaz was astounded to hear that these 3 young men speak English.
Folger's amazement grows when he finds that the island is populated by only 1 Englishman, Alexander Smith, 4 women, and 20 children. Where are the other mutineers? Smith describes what happened. After kidnapping 12 women and 6 men from Tahiti, Christian and his 8 fellow mutineers sailed Bounty 8,000 miles, visiting numerous islands before settling on Pitcairn.
The clincher to picking Pitcairn was the fact that it was mischarted on the Royal Navy charts. So Christian decided that if the Royal Navy was looking for them, they would have to trip over them to find the island, and that's where they settled.
Soon after being stripped, Bounty mysteriously catches fire and sinks, making detection and escape virtually impossible. For a time, Pitcairn proves to be Eden on Earth. Then prejudice, jealousy, and drunkenness turn the small island into a battlefield.
When they arrived at Pitcairn, they divided all the property among the white people, the 9 mutineers. All of them treated the Polynesians now as servants rather than as companions and friends. And that was really the ultimate cause for the bloodshed that occurred on Pitcairn.
Smith grimly reports that beginning on September 20th, 1793, a murderous civil war erupted between the white and Polynesian men. By 1801, all of the Englishmen were dead, except Smith. When Folger presses Smith for details of Fletcher Christian's death, the mutineer proves evasive. On different occasions, he claims that Christian was murdered, committed suicide, and died of natural causes. In the end, Folger's report only serves to fan the fires of speculation.
There is a story that he somehow got off the island. And in fact, the intriguing things, Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner, the famous poem, is supposed to be written as a version of his escape from Pitcairn and his return to England.
This last theory gains momentum in 1809 when Bounty crewman Peter Heywood reports seeing Fletcher Christian on an English street. When he approaches, Heywood claims the mystery man gets a look of terror on his face and rushes off into the crowd.
Peter Heywood thought to his dying days that Christian may have returned to England.
For nearly 200 years, the controversy rages. What really happened to Fletcher Christian? Intent on finally discerning the truth, the mutineer's great-great-great-great-grandson, Glynn, begins searching for clues among long-forgotten family records. In the musty pages of a meticulously cross-referenced family history, Glynn finds an ancestor's definitive notation concerning Fletcher Christian.
Had Fletcher got back to England, the only motive worth the risk would have been to see his family, and of such an event, no tradition has been preserved.
There are several mentions in these documents about Fletcher Christian's death. I'm convinced that he died on Massacre Day on Pitcairn Island.
Satisfied that the truth lies on Pitcairn, Glynn mounts an expedition to the tiny island in 1980 to attempt to pinpoint where Fletcher Christian died and was buried.
When you walk around Pitcairn Island, which is what we did, it was like an 18th century thriller. If this was supposed to have happened, we stood there and said, well, could you have heard this? No. And so even the site where Fletcher Christian is supposed to have been shot, which you get shown on Pitcairn Island, is impossible.
In the end, Glynn decides that the only plausible version of Fletcher's death is the one recorded by a Pitcairn woman known as Jenny, who left the island in 1817.
Hers is the only one which can be believed because it's filled with personal, womanly things that we found we on the expedition we could believe and which we could prove.
According to Jenny, Fletcher Christian had been working close to home one day to be near his pregnant wife. He was gunned down near a pond in his garden and buried where he fell. Using Fletcher's home site as a starting point, Glynn searches the surrounding area for clues that might corroborate Jenny's story.
And there, exactly where you draw it, if it were a fantasy, was a dried up pool within shouting distance of where Fletcher Christian's house was. And it's this pool that he's supposed to be buried beside.
In the end, Glynn Christian leaves Pitcairn Island certain that he is tantalizingly close to the truth about his famous relative, but equally certain that for many, the mystery may never be put to rest.
When I went to Pitcairn, I was given this piece of bounty itself. Virtually every day I look at it and I think, if only it had a voice. It was there when the mutiny happened. If only it could talk.
Descendants of the Bounty rebels are now involved in another mutiny of sorts, this time on tiny Pitcairn Island, population approximately 40. The island's residents, most of them directly related to the mutineers, have been complaining about cuts in aid from the British government. They've even issued what is for them the ultimate insult, comparing British Prime Minister Tony Blair to none other than Captain Bligh.
Imagine your house, your neighborhood, your entire town, flooded by a torrent of mud, gushing from a crack in the earth. This frightening scenario happened in 2006 in Sidoarjo, a town in East Java, Indonesia. The mud began its assault on May 29th.
Over the course of the next few months, the rate at which mud came up to the surface increased dramatically and has persisted for a couple years without any signs of slowing down.
The phenomenon is called a mud volcano, and it has unleashed its slow-motion destruction over 1,500 acres, destroying villages, factories, and fields. 30,000 people have been displaced.
There's lots of seepage from over there. This area was all paddy fields. There were paddy fields all the way down there.
The mud that's erupting is also hot, so it's not easy to recolonize or resettle the area that's been erupting. And some of the mud is now going into rivers and streams and then into the ocean.
A mud volcano is a natural phenomenon that originates deep within the earth, where deposits of mud exist. Tectonic activity, compaction of sediments, or an accumulation of hydrocarbon gases force changes in the pressure of the mud. These pressure changes propel the mud upward to the surface, where it's expelled. The Indonesian mud volcano is one of the world's largest, shooting over 46 feet into the air.
Real volcanoes erupt in part because there are gases in the magma, the molten rock. Those gases make the magma light, and light things go up. And mud volcanoes contain lots of dissolved gases too. And so these gases form bubbles as the mud rises to the surface. It makes it lighter, and that helps drive the eruption.
What triggered this rare occurrence in East Java? Some experts believe it was caused by an engineering disaster, because the site of the eruption was near a natural gas drilling well. Geologists who have studied the mud volcano firsthand concluded that the Lapindo Brantas Company was drilling to a depth of more than 9,000 feet.
And the depth at which the muds are erupting is similar to that. And we know how deep the muds are coming from by looking at the types of muds that are erupted compared to what the drillers pull up in the well when they're drilling.
According to the geological experts, on May 28th, the day before the mud began erupting, the natural gas company had drilled to 9,297 feet. They pulled the drill bit out of the hole, and this probably triggered a catastrophic kick of hydrogen sulfide gas and water from the surrounding rocks. The water and gas began filtering up through the well bore. To prevent the toxic mixture from escaping, the company capped the well. This could have created an increase in pressure inside the hole that fractured the rocks. The fractures allowed the mud to travel to the surface and erupt. The actual mud volcano was 590 feet away from the well. But could the eruption have been caused instead by natural forces? Such as the assertion of the Indonesian drilling company, which claims that an earthquake 2 days before the disaster must have been responsible.
Many institutions did some studies, many geologists, engineers. They tend to say that this is natural disaster rather than mechanical or technical problems of the drilling.
But engineers both in Indonesia and around the world have disputed this claim, finding that the earthquake was too distant, 300 miles from the eruption, and at 6.3 on the Richter scale, too weak to cause this kind of mass destruction.
Indonesia is probably the most seismically active region on Earth, and so there are lots and lots of earthquakes. And there would have been many times in the last 30 years that an earthquake might have triggered an eruption, and it never did. And some of the shaking caused by those other earthquakes is much, much bigger, as much as 100 to 1,000 times bigger shaking.
The government of Indonesia brought in engineers from around the world to work on stopping the mud flow. One unconventional method has been to drop concrete balls held together by chains into the crater to plug it up. It's the first time anything like this has been attempted.
When we start this project, basically, there are a lot of concern from society in general, and in fact from some scientific community, that this could lead to things like the balls will become projectile. And so far, thanks God, it's not happened.
Despite the effort to cork the source of the mud, the output of the volcano has increased from 5,000 cubic meters a day in 2006 to 150,000 cubic meters today. Some enterprising farmers are harvesting salt from the mud and selling it at the markets. And the phenomenon presents an exceptional chance to study mud volcanoes at close range.
It'd be a shame if we don't learn anything from this disaster. And here we have a well that goes all the way down, and you have a special opportunity, maybe a unique opportunity, to look at the complete history of a mud volcano, from before its initiation, through its evolution, and finally when it ends.
The mud volcano shows no signs of abating, so scientists may be able to observe it for years, and perhaps even decades to come.